Have you ever had to play peacekeeper in your household?
Picture this. You're 6 months from your dream wedding, the kind with fairy lights and a backyard barbecue in the Midwest. When your fiancé drops a bomb, he says his parents won't be there, and oh, by the way, you shouldn't meet them. Ever. My name's Sarah, and that's exactly what happened to me with Mark. I thought he was just being a protective goof, but curiosity's a sneaky beast, especially when you're pushing 42 and finally betting on forever. So I drove to their rundown house on the edge of town, heart pounding like I'd chugged too much coffee. When I knocked and saw what was inside, well, let's just say it froze me in place, and what came next turned our perfect life into a nightmare I never saw coming. Stick around, because this story's got twists that'll make you question every family secret you've ever ignored. I still remember the exact moment Mark shut down the conversation about his folks, right in the middle of picking out centerpieces for our wedding registry at that big box store in the suburbs. We'd been together 3 years, engaged for 6 months, and everything felt solid, like the kind of reliable happiness you chase after a messy divorce in your 30s. Mark's this tall, broad-shouldered guy with a laugh that fills a room, works in sales for a logistics firm, and he's got that easy charm that makes you forget the little inconsistencies, like why he never talks about his childhood beyond vague nods to a tough upbringing in rural Illinois. We were flipping through catalogs, debating lilies versus roses, when I casually asked if his parents might want input on the menu, maybe some family recipe to make it personal. He froze, his fork midway to his mouth during our post-shopping lunch at the diner next door, and said flat out, "They're not coming, Sarah. And it's better if you don't meet them." Just like that, no explanation, his eyes darting to the window like he was checking for eavesdroppers. I laughed it off at first, thinking he was pulling my leg or embarrassed about some quirky relatives who might show up in overalls and start line dancing. Come on, Mark, it's our wedding. Families are supposed to clash a bit. That's half the fun, I teased, nudging his foot under the table. But he didn't bite, just muttered something about old wounds and changed the subject to the honeymoon itinerary, all beaches and no drama. That night, as we curled up on the couch with takeout Thai, I pressed a little harder, my curiosity bubbling up like the spicy noodles I was regretting. Are they sick? Fighting? I mean, I get privacy, but this feels off. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and admitted they were reclusive types who'd cut ties years ago, and dragging them into our lives would only stir up trouble. His voice had that edge, the one he gets when closing a tough deal, and I dropped it, not wanting to poke the bear when things were otherwise golden. But doubts have a way of festering, especially when you're knee-deep in wedding chaos, bridesmaid dresses that don't fit right, a venue deposit that's non-refundable, and invitations staring you down from the kitchen counter. My best friend Lisa, who's been through 2 weddings herself and knows all about red flags from her ex's side of the family, called me the next day while I was at work, buried in client emails. "Sarah, honey, if he's hiding his parents, that's not quirky, that's a neon sign. Remember my cousin's husband? Turned out his mom was in prison for check fraud." I chuckled, picturing Mark's straight-laced self in some soap opera scandal, but her words stuck like gum on my shoe. By evening, after Mark left for his weekly poker night with the guys, another thing, he kept light on details. I found myself scrolling through old photos on his phone while he was in the shower. There was one faded snapshot from his wallet, tucked behind his license, a young Mark, maybe 10, standing next to what looked like an identical twin, both grinning in front of a farmhouse, but the other boy's face was scratched out just enough to blur it. My stomach twisted. Coincidence or clue? That image haunted me through the week, turning every casual chat into a minefield. Mark noticed my distraction during our date night at that Italian place we love, the one with the garlic bread that could make you forget your own name, and asked if everything was okay. I forced a smile, blaming pre-wedding jitters, but inside I was churning. What kind of man builds a future with you but walls off his past like it's radioactive? By Friday, with the wedding 3 months away and me feeling like a fool for letting it slide, I made the call no, not to him, but to myself. I needed answers, even if it meant going rogue. I waited until he was out running errands, grabbed his old glove compartment find from the car, a crumpled address scribbled on a receipt from years back, and punched it into my GPS. The drive to their place on the outskirts of town took 40 minutes, past cornfields turning gold in the fall sun, my hands gripping the wheel tighter with every mile. Part of me screamed to turn back. This was invasive, stupid, the kind of choice that could blow up our life. But the bigger part, the one tired of half-truths, pushed on. The house loomed at the end of a gravel drive, a sagging two-story with peeling paint and overgrown weeds that screamed neglect. Nothing like the tidy split-level Mark and I shared. My heart hammered as I parked and walked up, the air thick with that rural quiet broken only by distant dog barks. I smoothed my sweater, rehearsed a friendly, "Hi, I'm Sarah, Mark's fiancé," and knocked, the sound echoing too loud. Footsteps shuffled inside, slow and hesitant, and then the door inched open, revealing dim light and shadows that didn't quite match the outline of a person. A faint, metallic clink came from within, like chains or tools being set down, and I froze. My mind racing to worst-case scenarios that no rom-com ever prepares you for. Mark's confrontation hit like a cold splash the morning after my impulsive drive. But let's back up to that creaky door moment, because that's when the real unease settled in my bones with a persistence that no amount of rationalizing could shake loose during the long ride home, or even in the quiet hours afterward when I replayed every hesitant step and muffled sound in my mind. The woman who answered, his mother, I assumed, though she looked more like a ghost from one of those true crime podcasts Lisa devours during her late-night shifts as a nurse, peered out with watery eyes framed by stringy gray hair that seemed untouched by comb or care for far too many days, her thin frame almost fragile in a faded house dress that hung off her shoulders like it hadn't been washed or fitted properly in weeks, and the house behind her reeked of stale air mixed with something sharper and more unsettling, like the musty pileup of old newspapers mingling with the faint undercurrent of regret and unwashed dishes accumulated over years of isolation. "Can I help you?" she rasped in a voice that cracked as if speaking to strangers had become a forgotten skill eroded by time and solitude, her hands clutching the doorframe with knuckles white from tension or perhaps just the chill seeping through the gaps in the wood. I swallowed hard against the sudden dryness in my throat, forcing my brightest smile, the one I use for nervous clients during marketing pitches when they're on the fence about a campaign, and said as steadily as I could manage, "Hi, I'm Sarah, engaged to Mark. And I know this is out of the blue, but I wanted to meet you, maybe chat about the wedding plans since it's coming up so fast and it feels right to include family voices in the mix." Her face crumpled for a split second as if my words had landed like an unexpected punch to an already bruised heart, before she nodded weakly and stepped aside with a murmured invitation to come in, adding in a whisper that carried the weight of unspoken warnings, "But Mark wouldn't like this at all, you understand. He's always been the one to keep things separate." The entryway swallowed me into a narrow hallway cluttered with towering stacks of magazines yellowed at the edges and cardboard boxes overflowing with what looked like forgotten mail and random household items that forced me to sidestep carefully like navigating a junkyard maze designed by someone who had long ago stopped caring about order or accessibility, the floorboards creaking under my weight with every cautious movement that echoed too loudly in the confined space. She led me to a dim living room where her husband sat slumped in a worn recliner that seemed molded to his burly frame. A man with a beard gone wild and unkempt like an overgrown hedge and eyes that darted suspiciously from side to side as if expecting intruders even in his own home. Nursing a mug that wafted an aroma suspiciously like something stronger than morning coffee to dull the edges of whatever demons lurked in his daily routine. "This is Sarah," she introduced with a tentative gesture, her hands twisting a threadbare dish towel as if it were a lifeline, and he grunted a minimal hello without fully looking up from the flickering TV screen showing some ancient game show rerun with contestants cheering over prizes that felt worlds away from this shadowed existence. I perched on the edge of a sagging couch whose springs groaned in protest under my slight shift, the fabric rough and dotted with faint stains from spills or time, and tried to steer the conversation toward lighter ground by mentioning the weather's crisp turn and the scenic drive out here through the golden cornfields, then sharing how Mark and I had met at a work conference 3 years earlier where a spilled coffee led to our first real talk amid the chaos of booths and networking. handshakes. But every question I posed about them or their lives bounced off like rubber balls against a solid wall of evasion, their responses clipped and circling back to neutral topics without ever delving into the personal territory I hoped to explore. Especially when I gently asked about family traditions that might inspire something special for the wedding reception, like a favorite recipe passed down through generations or holiday customs that could add a touch of warmth to our backyard setup. She hesitated then, her gaze flicking toward her husband with a silent plea for guidance or permission, and said softly with a tremor in her voice that hinted at buried pain, "We lost so much over the years, the boys you know." It's hard to think on those times without the ache coming back fresh as yesterday. Boys, plural. The word landed with a jolt that quickened my pulse and flashed me straight back to that scratched-out photo on Mark's phone, the one where the twins' face blurred into mystery. But before I could probe further without seeming too insistent, her husband cleared his throat gruffly with a sound like gravel shifting and interjected, "Mark's doing fine on his own out there. No need to drag us into your celebrations or stir up what's best left settled." The air in the room thickened instantly with that unspoken boundary, heavy as the dust motes dancing in the thin light filtering through half-drawn curtains, and that's when I spotted a framed picture on the mantel shelf partially obscured by a layer of grime, showing two young boys who looked identical as reflections in a calm pond, one with Mark's exact lopsided smile captured in boyhood innocence, the other dusted over just enough to suggest neglect or deliberate obscurity. I managed to stay for maybe 20 minutes in total, filling the time with forced chatter and even cracking a light joke about how Mark still burns toast every single morning without fail, which drew a thin, fleeting smile from her as if the normalcy of such a complaint pierced through their veil for a brief moment, and she even offered a cup of weak tea served in chipped porcelain mugs that clinked softly against the saucers with hands that trembled slightly from nerves or age. As I rose to leave, promising vaguely to stay in touch and perhaps visit again under better circumstances, she pressed a small worn keychain into my palm without warning, shaped like a tiny tractor engraved with the words "For the Lost One," in faded script that carried an emotional punch far beyond its simple metal form, and whispered close to my ear, "Tell him we miss both our boys more than words can cover, every single day." Both boys again. The phrase echoed in my skull like a riddle half solved as I nodded mutely and slipped out the door, which clicked shut behind me with a finality that resonated through the quiet porch, the gravel crunching under my shoes as I hurried to the car with the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. Driving back through those same cornfields now bathed in the softer light of late day, I rolled down the windows to let the fresh air rush in and dispel the musty scent that clung to my clothes like an unwelcome memory. Feeling a turbulent mix of triumph for having taken the step and guilt for crossing into territory Mark had clearly marked off limits. Wondering what kind of parents could ghost their own sons so completely and why the talk of loss carried such cryptic layers that hinted at stories untold. By the time I pulled into our driveway with the sun dipping low toward the horizon and painting the split-level house in warm hues, I was buzzing with unanswered questions that swirled in my thoughts, but determined to play it cool around Mark to avoid immediate fallout. Though that resolve tested thin as I stepped inside and smelled the familiar comfort of our shared space. That determination held barely until dinner when Mark walked in from his long day at the office, his tie loosened around his neck, and that tired but genuine grin spreading across his face as he complimented the lingering aroma of the pasta sauce I'd thrown together earlier. But then his eyes narrowed sharply on my expression, which must have betrayed the turmoil churning beneath my attempted composure. "You look off somehow, like you've got the weight of the world on you. Everything okay with the wedding stuff or work?" he asked while hanging up his coat. And I debated spilling the entire encounter right there over the kitchen table, but felt the keychain burning in my pocket like contraband too hot to handle. So instead, I tested the waters indirectly by mentioning family ties in general and asking if his parents ever reminisced about the old farm days with fondness or regret. His fork paused midway to his mouth with a drop of sauce trailing down, and he set it down slowly with deliberate care before responding in a tone that edged toward accusation. "Sarah, what exactly did you do today that has you acting so strange?" The question hung in the air thick with implication, and before I could weave a deflection or half-truth, my phone buzzed insistently on the counter with a text from an unknown number that read simply, "Please come back soon. We need to explain about the other boy before it's too late," and it was unmistakably her voice translated to words, somehow having gotten my contact from who knows where. Mark's face drained of all color as he leaned over to read it over my shoulder, his hand snatching the phone with a grip that turned his knuckles white, and he demanded in a low, furious whisper that built quickly, "You went there without telling me. Alone to that house I specifically asked you to avoid. Damn it, Sarah, I told you straight out to stay. Away for good reasons you can't even imagine." His anger boiled over into a full lecture about respecting boundaries and the trust we'd built over 3 years now teetering on this one reckless choice. Pacing the kitchen linoleum like a caged animal desperate for release, while I sat there stunned with the pasta growing cold and congealed on our plates, the savory smells turning cloying in the tension. He ranted on about protecting me from their complicated mess of a life, how they'd fallen apart completely after some deep family tragedy he refused to name outright but alluded to with shadows in his eyes, and how my meddling could unravel everything we'd carefully constructed together, from late-night talks to shared dreams of a future unmarred by old pains. I fired back in defense, my own hurt sharpening into accusations of him treating me like a fragile child instead of an equal partner ready to face whatever came with the commitment we were making. But deep down that repeated echo of the other boy gnawed at me relentlessly like an itch I couldn't scratch without drawing blood. We retreated to bed that night with our backs turned to each other in the king-sized mattress that suddenly felt too vast and cold, the silence between us louder and more accusatory than any shouted argument could have been. And I lay awake long into the darkness, plotting not a direct confrontation but something more subtle to even the score and reclaim a bit of control in this spiraling uncertainty. The next day, while Mark was buried in meetings at the logistics firm across town, I drove over to the neighbor's farm about a mile down the winding road, the one with the nosy collection of mailbox flags waving in the breeze, and left an anonymous note tucked into their door about potential safety hazards at the old house next door, vague enough to suggest concern without pointing fingers directly at me or revealing too much. The kind of nudge that might prompt a casual welfare check from the county without escalating to drama. It felt a touch petty in the moment, like anonymously reporting a neighbor's overgrown lawn to the homeowners association just to watch them scramble. But later that afternoon, as I watched from a discreet distance through binoculars borrowed from Mark's camping gear, seeing a county vehicle pull up slowly to the sagging house and an official stepping out with a clipboard gave me a wicked spark of satisfaction that warmed me against the chill of what I'd stirred. Let them feel a bit of pressure for once, I thought with a grim smile. Maybe it would loosen a few tongues or at least force some changes in that hoarded haze. Little did I realize that this small act of revenge was merely the spark igniting a much larger fire when my phone rang, unexpectedly, that same night with his mother's voice on the line, pleading in broken tones for me to return and hear the full untold story behind the shadows I'd only begun to glimpse. The call from Mark's mother came slicing through the fragile piece of our evening like an uninvited interruption right as I was trying to piece back together the strained normalcy with a bottle of that affordable red wine we kept for tough days and some takeout barbecue. From the smoky joint downtown where the ribs fell off the bone so tender they practically melted on your tongue, and the sauce left sticky evidence on your fingers that spoke to indulgence amid the building storm of secrets in our home. Mark having cooled off just enough during the workday to send apologetic texts blaming his outburst on the pressure from a major client pitch at the logistics firm that demanded his full focus and left little room for emotional side trips. I let his olive branch slide, because who in their right mind wants to fully torpedo a 3-year relationship and the wedding plans we'd poured heart and savings into over one impulsive visit to a rundown farmhouse when the invitation sat half-addressed on the dining table waiting for stamps, and the venue deposit loomed like a non-refundable anchor. But when my phone lit up with that unfamiliar local area code around 8 o'clock as the TV droned some mindless sitcom in the background, her shaky voice breaking through with, "Sarah, it's Evelyn. Please don't hang up. We need to talk more. Come back when you can." It sliced the air and my composure in equal measure. Mark still in the kitchen rummaging for napkins and plates, so I quickly muted the call and stepped out onto the back porch where the night air carried a crisp bite that matched the chill running down my spine under the scattering of stars overhead. That cryptic plea looped relentlessly in my head through the rest of the meal, where Mark's attempts at light-hearted jokes about our upcoming vows and the inevitable awkward toasts from distant relatives landed flat against my distraction as I picked at the pulled pork and coleslaw that suddenly tasted like ash mixed with barbecue tang, my forced laughs coming out too sharp and insincere while my mind raced back to the dim hallway shadows and that peculiar keychain now hidden away in my jewelry box like a talisman of trouble waiting to unleash more revelations. Why the urgency now after years of radio silence from their side, and what exactly did she mean by needing to explain before it was too late? Was it addiction tearing them apart, or some deeper debt scandal that could spill over into our stable life, or perhaps a family feud so bitter it explained Mark's ironclad walls around his past like a fortress built from childhood bricks? Folks in their 40s and 50s watching this would nod along knowingly to that creeping doubt the way past mistakes from ex-spouses or blended family dramas shadow even the sunniest engagements, turning what should be pure joy into a minefield of what-ifs that make you question every reassuring smile. And I found myself disagreeing with my own stubborn pull to keep digging when Lisa had texted earlier that afternoon with her no-nonsense advice straight from her experiences with two messy weddings of her own. Drop this whole thing cold, Sarah, before you unearth skeletons that belong buried and drag your fresh start down with them into the muck. Her words landing like a sensible slap that I ignored because tuning out the warning felt easier than admitting the red flags waving wildly in my face. By the time we cleared the takeout containers and settled on the couch for a movie neither of us really watched, my resolve had hardened into something sharper than before. I'd snoop in a smarter way this time without the risk of another doorstep confrontation that could blow up our fragile truce, turning to digital trails instead of gravel drives under suspicious skies. The next morning, while Mark hummed off-key in the shower getting ready for his weekend run along the lake trail that wound through the suburban parks, I seized the moment to borrow his laptop under the casual pretense of checking my work emails for a freelance marketing gig that needed quick revisions on a client ad campaign. My fingers flying across the keys to dive into his browser history like a cautious detective piecing together clues from one of those gripping Netflix thrillers we binged together on rainy nights. Buried beneath layers of routine searches for sales reports and fantasy football updates from his league buddies were older queries that hit like puzzle pieces snapping into place. Phrases like twin brother disappearance, rural Illinois 1990s, and local hoarding support groups near our town, alongside a clicked link to an archived news article from 25 years prior detailing a tragic case of a local boy vanishing from a family farm during a severe storm presumed drowned in the swollen creek that bordered their property with the body never recovered to provide closure. The grainy black and white photo accompanying the story showed two young boys standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a weathered barn, one unmistakably a boyhood version of Mark with his characteristic cowlick and shy grin captured in that awkward preteen phase. The other his spitting image named David according to the caption that described the devastated family clinging to hope amid the search efforts that spanned weeks through flooded fields and dense woods, the article painting a picture of small-town grief that rippled through neighbors and volunteers who combed the area with dogs and divers, but came up empty-handed. My breath caught sharp in my throat as the pieces clicked with an uneasy finality. The lost boy from Evelyn's whispers explained in stark terms, but layered with questions about why Mark had buried this so deep, never mentioning even a whisper of a twin, let alone a sibling's presumed death that surely shaped his every guarded step. Had he fabricated the full story of closure to escape the endless pitying questions from casual acquaintances, or was there an undercurrent of personal guilt from that stormy night that made reopening the wound unbearable for all involved? That discovery fueled a fire in me that burned through the morning chores like sorting through fabric swatches for bridesmaid dresses and confirming RSVPs over coffee that tasted too bitter now, pushing me toward a revenge that felt justified in its sly cleverness to peel back one more layer without direct confrontation. During our lunch ritual at the park that afternoon, where we unpacked turkey sandwiches on the weathered bench overlooking the shimmering lake dotted with families picnicking and kids skipping stones, I accidentally synced his phone to my cloud account using the shared setup we'd established for organizing trip photos from our last vacation to the Smoky Mountains, flipping a few privacy settings with feigned clumsiness so that his search notifications would ping directly to my device like an invisible tether exposing his digital footsteps in real time. It was a petty move in the grand scheme, sure, like swapping the sugar for salt in a colleague's coffee mug just to watch their face pucker during the meeting. But the immediate thrill hit when my phone buzzed later that afternoon while I was at the grocery store picking up ingredients for a trial run of the wedding cake recipe, alerting me to his frantic midday query about erasing old family records legally in Illinois conducted from his work browser that suggested he was scrambling to cover tracks deeper than I'd imagined. Got you there, I thought, with a grim inward chuckle, picturing him at his desk in the open-plan office, sweating over the implications of digital ghosts resurfacing. That small act of witty payback evening the scales a fraction and making me feel less like the reckless intruder in his hidden world and more like the partner deserving of unfiltered truth in our impending marriage. But that empowering rush faded quickly as the evening unfolded, with fresh wedding tensions piling on like uninvited guests, the officiant we'd booked canceling out of the blue due to a sudden family emergency that left us scrambling through directories for a replacement amid a flurry of venue confirmation calls that ate into my freelance hours and stretched my patience thin as over pulled taffy. Mark vented his frustrations over a simple dinner of stir-fried veggies and chicken that I'd whipped up from the fridge staples, his voice rising in pitch as he paced between the island and the sink, detailing the hassle of rescheduling while I nodded along, but inside the dilemma clawed deeper. Should I confront him now with the article printout tucked in my planner, forcing a raw discussion that could heal or shatter us, or continue this solo quest that risked alienating everyone, including my own better judgment? Viewers tuning in would likely shake their heads at my choices here, seeing the blatant warning signs from the hoarding hints to the twins' tragedy and urging a straightforward exit from this tangled web before it ensnared our future. But love has a way of blinding you to the exit signs, especially when you've invested not just emotions, but practical dreams like joint bank accounts and shared lease renewals. As the clock edged past midnight, with the house settling into quiet creaks and the glow of my bedside lamp casting long shadows on the walls, another twist arrived unannounced in the form of a faded envelope slipped under our front door during the hours we'd been out earlier, postmarked from the small post office in his parents' rural town, containing nothing but a single printed photo showing an adult version of Mark and the long-lost twin, both with their backs turned to the camera, walking away from the familiar outline of the farmhouse under a stormy sky that mirrored the article's fateful night. No accompanying note, just that haunting image staring up from the textured paper, implying secrets not fully laid to rest and presences perhaps still lingering in unexpected ways. My hands trembled as I quickly hid it in the back of my nightstand drawer. But sleep proved elusive, replaced by vivid visions of what Evelyn's unfinished warning truly meant and how deep the roots of this family pain extended. Little did I know that the parents' escalating pleas would draw me back into the fray sooner than anticipated, pulling me toward revelations that would test every vow I'd ever considered sacred. Evelyn's mysterious photo arrived like an unwelcome specter, haunting the edges of what should have been a straightforward week, focused on tying up the loose ends of our wedding preparations, such as finalizing the tasting for that decadent carrot cake with layers of spiced goodness and cream cheese frosting from the beloved downtown bakery, where the owner always added extra walnuts just for regulars, and dodging Mark's increasingly noticeable edginess about the entire affair that manifested in his clipped responses during our evening wind-downs and his habit of checking his phone more frequently, as if expecting bad news to ping through at any moment. He'd ramped up the attentiveness since our last spat, showering me with unexpected bouquets from the local farmers market, bursting with autumn colors and suggesting spontaneous outings like that drive-in theater on the outskirts showing classic rom-coms from the 90s that we both loved for their predictable happy endings. But everything about it felt performative now, like he was hastily papering over widening cracks in our foundation that I could sense vibrating beneath the surface with every casual touch or shared laugh that rang a touch too hollow. I stashed the envelope deep in my desk drawer, telling myself it served as quiet leverage, a tangible clue to unravel the persistent riddle of the both boys' mystery without necessitating another rash visit to that sagging farmhouse. But Evelyn's voice from the porch call echoed persistently in my quieter moments, her unfinished plea hanging like a loose thread begging to be pulled until the whole unraveling threatened to expose more than I bargained for. By midweek, with the replacement officiant locked in after hours of phone tag and my latest freelance project wrapping up ahead of schedule, granting me a rare pocket of free time, the magnetic pull toward answers became impossible to ignore, uncertainty gnawing at me like relentless termites undermining the sturdy beams of trust we'd built over 3 years together. Lisa issued her stern warning over steaming lattes at our favorite corner cafe, her eyes rolling skyward as I recounted the envelope's arrival and the article's chilling details from my phone screen, her no-nonsense demeanor honed from navigating two chaotic weddings of her own, cutting straight to the chase with, "You're dancing way too close to the flames here, Sarah. What if this uncovers abuse or something criminal that stains your whole future? Walk away now before it scorches that hard-won happy ending you've been chasing since your divorce left you gun-shy about commitments." And she had every valid point, etched from personal scars like her ex's gambling debts that drained their savings and turned family gatherings into battlegrounds. But at 42, with a career in marketing that thrived on reading subtle cues between the lines, ignoring this felt akin to signing a contract blindfolded on a dotted line that could hide landmines beneath the fine print. So I charted the course for another drive that Thursday afternoon, fabricating a cover story for Mark about an extended client meeting in the neighboring county, my conscience prickling uncomfortably like a persistent rash under my sweater as I gripped the wheel through the familiar route past the golden cornfields, now swaying under skies heavy with the promise of rain that mirrored the storm brewing in my chest. The farmhouse appeared even more desolate upon approach, weeds encroaching further on the gravel drive, and the structure itself seeming to sag deeper into the earth, as if burdened by the weight of unspoken histories. Evelyn answering the door with a haste that betrayed her relief, her face lighting up with a desperate gleam as she pulled me inside, past the hallway now even more choked with piled debris, magazines and boxes forming precarious towers that forced awkward maneuvers through the narrow path. Tom was nowhere in sight at first, Evelyn explaining vaguely that he was out back tending to the old shed where he tinkered with farm relics from better days, and she guided me to the cramped kitchen with its 4 mica counters completely buried under stacks of unopened canned goods, yellowed newspapers, and assorted knickknacks that spoke to a hoarding compulsion spiraling unchecked, a dim space lit by a single overhead bulb casting harsh shadows on the walls scarred from years of neglect. Over cups of lukewarm coffee served in mismatched mugs chipped from overuse, she began opening up in fragmented bursts, her words tumbling forth like marbles scattered across a tilting floor, recounting how Mark and David had been inseparable twins bound tighter than most siblings growing up on that very farm, thick as thieves in their adventures from dawn chores to sunset escapades, until that devastating summer 25 years ago when David vanished without a trace during a ferocious storm. Presumed swept away into the raging creek while fishing alone, his small body never recovered to offer the family any semblance of closure or peace. The grief had fractured them irreparably, Tom retreating into bottles to numb the endless replay of what-ifs, while Evelyn turned to collecting feverishly anything that evoked David's memory, from his favorite toys to articles of clothing, building a fortress of possessions as a twisted way to keep his spirit tethered close and prevent the void from swallowing her whole. "Mark carries the heaviest load, though," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as her fingers traced the rim of her mug. "He blames himself utterly for not being there that day, thinks his presence might have changed the outcome. So he fled, built a new life, scrubbed clean of the pain, and told the world David was gone forever, to dodge the pitying stares and probing questions that followed us everywhere like unwanted shadows." That narrative struck me with the force of a gut punch, illuminating Mark's evasions as a protective shield forged in survivor's guilt. But as she spoke haltingly of the aftermath, I noticed the hallway door standing slightly ajar, one I'd dismissed as a mere closet during my first visit, now revealing a glimpse of descending stairs shrouded in deeper darkness that piqued my curiosity, overriding the caution that should have kept me seated. "What's down there exactly?" I asked, my voice steady, but laced with the thrill of impending discovery, Evelyn paling visibly as she stammered excuses about it being mere storage for seasonal items, but I pressed gently yet firmly, heart thumping with the adrenaline of forbidden exploration, until she relented with a heavy sigh, leading me down the creaky wooden steps into a basement room illuminated by a solitary bare bulb swinging faintly from the low ceiling, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of disuse. Walls lined with sagging shelves groaned under the weight of meticulously arranged items, all belonging to David, toys frozen in time from his childhood, baseball mitt to faded comic books, clothes folded with ritual care, and photographs pinned haphazardly showing the twin in happier moments, a shrine to the lost boy that reeked of desperate delusion and unyielding despair. In the center stood a life-sized mannequin dressed in an old fishing vest identical to one hanging forgotten in Mark's closet back home, its blank face staring vacantly. Amid scrawled notes tacked everywhere proclaiming, "He'll return someday," the other one holds the key. In Evelyn's shaky handwriting, my legs nearly buckled under the realization that this wasn't mere grief, but a full-blown hoarding hell, explaining the faint clink of chains I'd heard before, perhaps securing these memories against the outside world and raising horrifying questions about Mark's knowledge of the depth, or if he'd contributed to letting it fester unchecked. Stumbling back upstairs, my mind a whirlwind of shock and sympathy, I hugged Evelyn awkwardly across the cluttered table, promising to broach the subject with Mark in a way that might coax him toward reconciliation and professional help for them all. But the dilemma clawed at me viciously as I navigated the drive home through the now falling rain. Should I expose this heartbreaking chaos to force intervention, risking Mark's fury and potentially derailing our wedding, or bury it deeper, becoming complicit in the lie that isolated them further in their pain? Viewers would undoubtedly cringe at my lingering soft spot, urging a decisive break from this toxic entanglement before it poisoned our shared future, but empathy weaves chains stronger than steel, especially when you've glimpsed the raw underbelly of loss. Back at the house, Mark remained oblivious, humming contentedly while grilling burgers on the patio, the sizzle and smoky scent mingling with the damp evening air as he flipped patties with tongs and chatted about rehearsal dinner logistics. That night, as we ate under the string lights strung across the deck, I orchestrated my revenge with a sly wit that felt like reclaiming power, slipping into his email account on our shared home computer during a bathroom break, forwarding an anonymous tip to a regional support group for compulsive hoarding, complete with the farmhouse address and a discreet note about a family struggling in silence, needing outreach, no traces leading back to me. Just a clever nudge toward aid that imagined their surprise at the eventual knock on the door, giving me that satisfying zing of justice delivered quietly, like spiking a rival's drink with just enough laxative to make a point without full-blown war. Yet the fleeting high dissolved as Mark drew me close later on the couch, his arm around my shoulders, warm and reassuring as he murmured about accelerating the wedding timeline, perhaps eloping to a quiet beach spot to bypass the mounting fuss of guest lists and vendor hiccups, his eyes holding a vulnerable plea that now carried the weight of the twins' ghost in every flicker. But the basement's eerie echoes lingered in his touch, turning comfort into something shadowed as we finally drifted toward sleep, my phone vibrating once more on the nightstand with Tom's gruff incoming text that read, "You saw the truth, now don't tell Mark yet, come alone tomorrow for what really happened to David that night." The words hanging like a noose, tightening around the fragile peace we'd pretended to reclaim. Tom's ominous text burned a persistent hole in my pocket throughout the next day, turning our routine Saturday errands into a disorienting haze where even the simple grocery run for wedding rehearsal snacks, like those flaky croissants from the corner bakery and a stop at the hardware store for extra string lights to festoon the backyard patio, felt overshadowed by the gnawing weight of impending revelations that made Mark's casual hand on mine during the drive seem like a precarious not ready to slip at the slightest tug. He'd been all easy smiles that morning, joking about how our earlier talk of eloping to a serene beach getaway could sidestep the inevitable drama from chatty aunts and off-key speeches at the full reception, but I nodded along with laughs that came out strained and mechanical, my mind replaying the basement shrine's chilling details from the day before, those scrawled notes on the walls, and the mannequin's vacant stare merging with Evelyn's fragmented tales of loss to form a puzzle that refused to settle into any comforting shape. At 42, with a solid career in marketing that rewarded sharp instincts for hidden narratives, I should have recognized the endgame staring me down, confronted Mark head-on with the full scope of what I'd uncovered, demanded professional intervention for his parents, and protected our future from this creeping toxicity. But the seductive hook of what really happened to David drew me inexorably deeper, even as Lisa's imagined voice thundered in my head to bail out immediately before the inherited baggage derailed the fresh chapter we'd both earned after my own divorce scars and his guarded silences. Why pursue these ghosts when tangible happiness waited in the form of joint dreams like weekend hikes in the nearby state park and plans for a cozy home edition down the line? Viewers following along would likely root against my bullheaded choices here, cringing at the blatant risks from the hoarding horrors to the twins' unresolved tragedy, urging a swift, clean break from this familial quagmire before it contaminated the vows we were set to exchange in just 2 weeks. Yet love operates like a stubborn anchor, especially when laced with the illusion of control and the promise of closure that could mend what felt irreparably frayed. So I committed to one final visit that evening, spinning another white lie to Mark about a solo girls' night, catch up with Lisa over wine and appetizers at our usual spot, my conscience twisting uncomfortably as I slipped out the door into the gathering dusk. The rain from the previous day leaving the roads slick and reflective under the streetlights, mirroring the turmoil churning inside me during the 40-minute drive back to the farmhouse, where the structure loomed darker than before, its windows glowing faintly like wary eyes against the encroaching night. Tom met me at the threshold, this time his beard trimmed marginally for the occasion and his eyes rimmed red, but holding a clarity born of reluctant resolve, waving me toward the back porch, where Evelyn sat bundled in a shawl beside a portable hot plate simmering a pot of hearty stew that carried the comforting aroma of root vegetables and herbs, the first glimpse of domestic normalcy I'd encountered in their disordered world, cutting through the tension like a brief ray of sun. Conversation started tentatively with shared anecdotes from the farm's brighter eras, Tom chuckling gruffly about the twins' childhood pranks, such as tying his work boots to the fence post one April Fool's morning or racing homemade go-karts down the dirt lane, until Evelyn's laughter faded into quieter reflections on the unbreakable bond between Mark and David. But the undercurrent hummed with the weight of what was to come, and when I finally summoned the nerve to inquire directly about the shrine and the notes proclaiming David's potential return, Tom set his spoon aside with a deep resonant sigh that seemed to draw from years of bottled sorrow. It wasn't the accident everyone believes, Sarah. It went deeper than a simple slip into the creek, he confessed, his voice gravelly and measured as Evelyn whimpered softly, covering her face with trembling hands, the rain pattering anew on the porch roof like impatient applause to the unfolding truth. Turns out the twins had erupted into a fierce argument that stormy evening over something trivial, a neighborhood girl they'd both fancied in their teenage crushes, David storming off in a huff toward the creek's edge, where he lost his footing in the flash floods, his cries lost to the thunder. But Mark, racked with terror, had hidden the preceding fight, fabricating the story of a solitary outing to absolve his brother of any perceived recklessness, even in death. The body surfacing days later, battered and unrecognizable, yet the lie snowballed unchecked, Mark fleeing the farm to escape the gnawing guilt while his parents descended into isolation, Evelyn's hoarding a manic bid to preserve David's essence, and Tom's drinking a veil against the what-ifs that replayed eternally. He shielded us all in his way, Tom continued, meeting my gaze steadily. Didn't want you carrying this burden into your new life, but your visits stirred the embers we thought long cold. The other boy, he's gone, but his shadow lingers in ways we can't erase. The disclosure crashed over me like the creek in full rage, not a sinister crime or lingering madness, but a young boy's desperate deception amplified by time into a family-wide cataclysm. Mark's secrecy, a flawed act of mercy that severed ties and bred deeper isolation, leaving me reeling on the porch steps as I thanked them haltingly for the honesty, promising discretion, while my mind fractured under the implications. Should I shatter the illusion by telling Mark I'd breached his boundaries again, compelling a collective reckoning that might heal fractured bonds, or risk exploding our wedding into irreparable shards, or maintain the silence, becoming an unwitting guardian of the deceit that had already cost so much? Driving home through the downpour, the wipers slashing rhythmically against the windshield, I wrestled the moral tangle, empathy clashing with self-preservation in a way that left me hollow. Yet that night, as Mark and I shared a quiet dinner of leftovers, his easy chatter about Finalizing the playlist for the reception, I channeled the turmoil into one last act of revenge crafted with pointed wit to force a reckoning without outright war, deciding to embed it seamlessly into our rehearsal dinner the following week, a toast amid friends and family that would drop the hint like a perfectly timed curveball to fresh starts and laying old ghosts to rest. Mark your past, forge the man I love. But here's to facing those twin shadows together, the ones we laugh about now in hindsight, sly enough to elicit chuckles from the crowd while planting seeds of exposure, making him squirm in the spotlight and confront the undercurrents publicly yet subtly without naming names or dragging skeletons fully into the light. 2 weeks blurred by in a whirlwind of last-minute preparations, the wedding dawn breaking clear and crisp, with fairy lights twinkling across the backyard venue transformed into a haven of white linens and blooming hydrangeas, Mark standing tall and handsome in his tailored suit, reciting vows with that familiar grin that once melted my doubts, but now carried the faint echo of his twins' unresolved gaze, my parents beaming from the front row alongside colleagues and a smattering of his work buddies, oblivious to the undercurrents as the ceremony sealed with a kiss under the archway of woven vines. The reception unfolded in the adjacent tent, band tunes swinging softly in the background, plates laden with grilled fare and that signature carrot cake drawing ooze from the guests. But during the toasts, as glasses clinked in the golden hour light, my words landed with the intended mix of warmth and edge, drawing light laughter and a few puzzled glances toward Mark, whose face tightened imperceptibly, whispering urgently later amid the milling crowd, "What exactly was that about Sarah?" The twin reference, it felt pointed, prompting my full confession in a hushed corner away from the festivities, the envelope, the visits, the basement truths spilling out in a rush that left him pale and shaken. He crumbled under the weight, admitting the lies' crushing toll, how he'd concealed the fight's details, and the ensuing guilt to spare me the crazy of his family's spiral, swearing David rested truly gone, with no imposters or further deceptions, just a survivor's armor cracked by time we embraced, then vowing joint counseling to mend the rifts for everyone involved. But as we swayed to the slow dance under the emerging stars, a final twist prickled at the edges, that keychain from Evelyn now nestled in my clutch, its engraving "For the Lost One" gleaming mockingly, and a fleeting silhouette in the distant crowd, a man lingering at the perimeter with Mark's sturdy build and a telltale scar snaking along his jaw matching the faded photo's hint. Was it mere coincidence, a distant relative drawn by whispers, or had the other boy truly circled back, watching from the fringes our union's fragile dawn? Our marriage launched amid those lingering enigmas, the revenge a bittersweet triumph that aired shadows without fully banishing them. Did I salvage a wounded family or demolish the illusions holding it together? Viewers left to ponder if the true terror lay not in the door's revelations, but in the inherited voids we carry forward, questioning every locked past in the ones we love.